Happy Tuesday, everybody. Good morning. I hope you're having a good day. I want to try and get back to recording my thoughts on the day's reading. I'm going to have to make this my last attempt. The reason I haven't gotten the video out for the last several days is I've gotten into it and I've tried and it's taken more time than I have, and I just haven't been able to get the video out in time. And I'm running into the same problem again. There's just so much good stuff to talk about. I'm just going to have to take some of this and make lessons or sermons out of it. But I'm going to try and at least touch on some of the interesting stuff in this. Today's reading is Judges chapter 17 and 18 and Psalm chapter 48. And Judges 17 and 18 tells us a story. Tomorrow's reading, 19 through 21, tells us another story. And these stories don't really fit in the chronology of Judges. Up to this point, chapters 1 through 16 have been kind of a chronological telling of the history of the nation after the death of Joshua. But these two stories they're at the end of the book, but chronologically they're closer to the beginning of the history. And it's almost like the author, they didn't really fit in the history he was telling, but they're such good representations of what was going on in the kingdom, in the nation at the time, that he wanted to include these two stories, even though they weren't specifically fit within the narrative he was telling beforehand. And so the one we're reading today is about Micah the Levite and the Danites. And I'm not going to summarize them because I don't have the time, and I'm assuming y'all are doing the reading. But I want to point out a couple interesting things. The common undercurrent between all of the reading today is what's summarized in verse 6. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. And this is a great summary for Judges, and this is where this comes from, is this chapter here. And this chapter so perfectly epitomizes this. You have Micah, the Levite, the Danites, they all were given a promise, right? God had given the nation a promise. He'd made a covenant with them. If you will do these things and be my people, I will be your God, and I will bless you, and I will conquer the land. And specifically for the promised land, the promise was, if you will hold to the covenant, I will drive out your enemies before you, and I will give you this land as an inheritance, and it'll be yours forever if you hold the promise, if you hold to the covenant. But he had given them warnings, if you don't, I'm not going to be with you, and I'm not going to bless you, and I'm not going to drive out the inhabitants. So it depends on you working with me. You've got to be obedient to what I've asked you to do. And if you do your part, I'll do my part. And what you see here is everyone in this story, they want the blessing, they want the original plan, but they want to do it their way. They don't want to do it the way God has ordained to do it. They're not interested in following what he told them to do. They want to do it their way, but they still want the blessing. And so you get that with Micah and the Levite. Let's just point out, I don't have time to talk about it, but what a great story to start with a son who robs his mom for a large amount of money, only gives it back. You get the sense he only gave it back because he's worried about the curse that she said, and so she blesses him to counteract it because that's going to work, right? Anyways, so he makes, these are probably wooden images. The metal images are probably a cast, like the mold from the silver. He makes his own shrine. He makes his own ephod, which is the garment of the priest. He makes his own household gods. He ordains one of his sons. None of this is according to the law, right? All of this is, you're explicitly not supposed to do this. You don't make your own shrine. You worship at the tabernacle. You don't make your own ephod. The priest, there's a specific way that was supposed to be made, a specific people who are supposed to make that. You don't make other gods. That's literally one of the first things that was said. And you don't ordain your own priests. God has specifically ordained people to be the priest, but he doesn't have one, so he's going to ordain one of his sons. And one interesting thing I want to point out here, he makes his own shrine. He's in he's at Ephraim. The tabernacle at this point in history is in Shiloh. Shiloh and Ephraim are in the same region. So it's not even like he had the excuse, which wouldn't have been good anyways, but he didn't even have the excuse that it was a long way off or anything. He just didn't want to go to Shiloh. He didn't want to worship at the tabernacle. He wanted to do it his way. And, the Bible doesn't give us a ton of his thought process, but I could imagine a whole bunch of reasons. Maybe he didn't like, anyways, I don't have time. You can imagine. Point is, he's building his own version of the worship, but this is not at all what God said. And then he finds this Levite, and I'll just make a point here. The Bible calls him a Levite. He calls himself a Levite, but he's of the family of Judah. Now, if I remember correctly, the Levites were of the tribe of Levi, and he's from Bethlehem. this was not one of the cities that God had given to the Levites as their portion in the inheritance of Israel. So, makes you wonder. One thing you will notice in this reading is that he's clearly motivated more by career and prosperity than he is by service to God. If you really are a priest of God, it's your duty to point out when people are directly going against the commandments that God had given. They're directly violating the things that God said were important. But he's perfectly happy to be this guy's priest because he's going to pay him 10 pieces of silver a year. He's going to clothe him, and he's going to provide a place for him to live and feed him. And so this is a cushy job. And so the Levite's happy to be his priest. And you see it from here. The guy's like, now I know the Lord's going to bless me because I have a real preacher. I've got a real preacher. God's got to bless me now. Well, if you can buy a preacher that you've bought, if you buy a preacher, you've bought nothing, because a preacher that can be bought is not a preacher at all. A minister should serve God. Chapter 18 comes to the Danites, and they're in the same kind of situation because, as I mentioned earlier, God had promised to help the nation take the land, but we saw in chapter 1 that they failed to complete the conquest because they failed to hold true to the covenant. And so this is a point I'll make here. I've made it in some of my sermons past, so you've probably heard me make this point before, but if we're serving God, and if we allow God to work in our lives, he will take us to places we could have never gotten on our own. He will empower us to do things we could have never done on our own. The flip side of that is if then I leave God and I remove myself from his service and become disobedient to him, he's going to remove his blessing, his presence. I'm going to find myself in a place where I can't succeed on my own because I needed God to get where I am. This is where they are. God, the whole plan was for them to conquer the whole land, not part of it, all of it. But it was by the power and blessing of God. And without that, they failed to complete the conquest. And Dan specifically, you read in chapter 1, verse 34, the Amorites pressed the people of Dan back into the hill country, did not allow them to come to the plains. So when we get to Judges 18, the Danites, they're seeking an inheritance. This isn't because because they had no inheritance. This isn't because God hadn't planned an inheritance for them or God hadn't made provision for them. It's because they decided they were going to opt out of God's way and do it their way. So yeah, now they have to find their own. And so, of course, you read it. I'll point out here, because we do this sometimes, they come to the priest and they ask him, is God with us? Is he going to bless us? And sometimes as a minister, or even just growing up and watching, in my dad's church, you see people who come and it's like, what's God's will for my life? What does God want me to do? And it's like, I don't have an answer for you. I mean, I do have an answer for you, but you don't need to ask me. The Bible has, there's all these things that you should be doing before, what you want is you want the big picture, like God tell me go do X, Y, Z and I'll bless you and I'll give you this or this or this. But the reality is you're not even living in a relationship with him. You've got to do that first. You can't live a life of hatred or, all these things that are clearly in the Word of God. And so here you have this tribe that's not doing what God asked them to do. They're outside the will of God, asking the priest if God's going to go with them. And of course, where this guy, again, it should have been assigned to them. You find this priest who's serving in this guy's house who's got gods. Is this really the guy you want to ask? But he's a priest, so they ask him. And he does what his character is going to say. He gives them the answer they want to hear because he's more interested in the approval of men than the approval of God. And then, of course, they come back and they take the priest and they take Micah's idols and they take him with them to be their priest. They want the same thing Micah was trying to get. They're trying to legitimize what they're doing. They're outside the will of God and they're trying to legitimize their actions. And I'm already running long again. So a couple things I'll point out here and I'll let you think about it and do your own research. One is look at, clearly this priest, again, we just see he's in it for the money. He's in it for the prestige. He's not in it to serve God. He sees this as, it's a step up. Is it better to be a priest for a house of one man, or is it better to priest for a whole tribe? Of course he's going to go with the tribe. The priest's heart was glad. And then I love this here. Micah, his response, when he discovers that they've stolen his gods and stolen his priest, he runs after them and he chases after them and he's going to fight him. He's going to get him back. And he's like, what is the matter with you people? What kind of people are you where you come and steal my gods and you steal my priest? You steal the gods that I made. It's like, you got this backwards. God is, you have to protect your God. Like, and it should be obvious, right? So anyways, a great reading today. I won't take any more of your time. I hope you have a wonderful day, and we'll touch back in the morning and talk about the next story. But if there's anything to take from this, it's that the blessings of God come via the relationship with God. You can't ignore everything that God has said and do it all your way and expect him to still bless. If you want to have the benefits of being close to God and being God's people, then you actually have to be God's people. You can't just do it whatever way you wanted to. And we see that here with this story. I love you guys, and we'll talk to you tomorrow.